Hello, I'm Michael Swinford. We'd like to welcome you to today's edition of the Veteran Voice. We will be exploring a subject today that has brought sorrow and sadness to many veterans and their families. It has also stirred the passions of the soul for a lot of men and women. And there are some who have explored the subject themselves and turned away unbelieving. Whatever your opinion on the POW issue is, we're going to be exploring some facts today. We'll be right back after this. We have with us today two gentlemen who are very aware of the POW situation. First on my left, Steve Reed. He's the commander of the VFW Post 5739 in Calvert City. And Mr. Bill Jordan. He's with JPAC. He's worked with JPAC in the recovery of remains of soldiers in Vietnam. So we have some experience here today to talk about some of these issues. I guess, Steve, I'll ask you the first question. Do you in your heart believe there are still live Americans in prisoner camps or being held in other countries?
From all conflicts?
Yeah, from all conflicts.
I would probably say yes. You know, it's personal belief.
Right. Have you seen any evidence to suggest that this is being done?
Not in recent years. Now, you know, back post-Vietnam era, you know, I believe I had, but...
Well, Bill, I ask you the same questions, being you were quite close to recovering remains and whatnot in Vietnam. Do you believe there might be Americans still alive in some other countries or in Vietnam even?
Not from the Indochina War, not from Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. There was a loss in the Gulf War, Commander Michael Swinford, and I sent a recovery team in there in 1995, and the evidence was very inconclusive that he was there, but there was evidence that he'd survived the crash. There's been a lot of work done over that, so that would be one that I would guess at.
Why do you think that it only started with the Vietnam veterans about their outcry and the protest because they believed so strongly that there were prisoners still being held? Why do you not think this happened in other wars?
I'm sure it did happen in other wars. It just, you know, it didn't per se make the news like it did after Vietnam. I think Vietnam brought awareness to a lot of things, not only the POW/MIA situations, but, you know, post-traumatic stress. You know, that just wasn't unique to Vietnam. Right. You know, Civil War, World War I, II, you know, anybody that's fought in war has got PTSD.
So there's been POWs and MIAs in all of America's war. How far do you go back to see the beginning?
It goes back to the Revolutionary War.
That far. And
according to, you know, some numbers on the website, the Revolutionary War had 18,152 POWs, 1,426 MIAs.
Wow.
You know, War of 1812, the Mexican War, it just keeps on going. Civil War. You know, the Union had 194,743 POW MIAs, and the Confederacy 214,865.
That's a lot of people that we really never heard about. It's not something that's been widely published. Bill, being you sort of had a hand-on experience in Vietnam, what is the first thing you do? Is it the investigation? Is that your first step?
It started, and of course, this information is dated a little bit because I retired in 1997, but it started with negotiation with the countries we're working in. And basically you tell them what you want to do, the evidence you've got, and you pick a site to go to. Then you investigate that crash site or incident site. You send out investigators with photos, details of the incident, and then if it warrants recovery, you send in what's known as an excavation team or recovery team to excavate it.
Well, on my last visit to Vietnam, I met with the ambassador to Vietnam, And also I got to discuss this issue with some of the JPAC members. They seem to me as a group to be the most dedicated people I have ever met. They believed in what they were doing, and they understood the comfort that it would ultimately cause to the family so they could have some closure. How big a team did you work with?
Normally, a recovery team consisted of 11 to 14 individuals. There was various skills there, including demolitions because of the wartime ordinance, linguists who spoke the language no matter what country we're in, and we sent teams into North Korea and Russia. We had the team scientific head was a physical anthropologist, a guy who could, or gal who could conduct the excavation itself, and then various graves registration personnel from the U.S. Army that knew how to do this type of work.
The time I was there, the Vietnamese government was turning over 3 sets of remains, and I was very honored to be able to witness that. It's a very moving ceremony. Do you think the Vietnamese government has been forthcoming in dealing with this issue?
I think they've been more forthcoming in recent years than they were earlier on.
Well, every time I bring up the subject over there, they come back and say, but we have 300,000 POWs, and these are the men and women in some cases that after a battle or a firefight or something, they simply took a bulldozer and pushed them into a big hole. So they come right back with that retort that, you know, our mothers cry as much as your mothers do, and it's a very sobering thought to realize there's that many POWs from the other side. Is there any initiative going on where we help them find their POWs?
This happened again after I left, but yes, we've passed records of battle incidents, things like that, known grave sites, and all the information we had attended to a loss of a Vietnamese individual over there during combat. So I think there's been a pretty good two-way street. But in my estimation, the Vietnamese cooperation was good. In the past, in the early days, they didn't tell us everything, quite obviously. They warehoused remains, which was a bad policy decision on their part, I think.
Yeah. Well, I wonder about Laos and Cambodia sometimes too. That they've always sort of been a dumping spot for Vietnam. The things that they won't allow in Vietnam, they do in Laos and Cambodia. Do you think there's possibilities that there could be POWs in Cambodia or Laos?
No, I think if there were, that would be more likely to have kept them in Laos or Cambodia. But I don't see how they could have survived because that's a pretty harsh environment. And we sent teams regularly to Laos and Cambodia. And of course, the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia in 1975. There was one American we know that was in captivity in Vietnam and Cambodia that was killed. We had evidence of that. But I just basically don't think anybody could have survived that long.
Why do you think that there were so many POWs in Vietnam?
Well, due to advances in weaponology, you know, I was in the Air Force in Vietnam, and I was in pararescue. You know, we had to go out and pick up the downed pilots. You know, a lot of air crews were captive in Vietnam. You know, a lot got shot down. A whole lot were captured on the ground. You know, I don't know why it was, you know, as far as the numbers go, you know, Korea was a whole lot more than Vietnam. But it just, you know, advance in weapons, I think, had a lot to do with it. You know, the SAM missiles and...
But didn't the terrain and the area, too, cause such a problem with finding these guys?
It was a different environment than, you know, we had fought in. Right. You know, now you had jungle in the Pacific, but, you know, it wasn't nothing like what was in Vietnam.
Well, when you're talking about triple canopies and things like this, it would be very difficult to find anything in the jungle.
You know, we would pick up or have a mission to pick up a downed pilot, and due to that double and triple canopy, you know, you could hear his beeper, and you know, you were on top of him, but you couldn't see nothing. You'd had to go down through it with a penetrator, and you know, a lot of times you didn't find them.
Do you think the federal government was aware of the total situation with our POWs back then? I mean, were they forthcoming in their discussions about the issue?
Yes, but I'm not sure how much they knew about it then. You have to remember that Vietnam was one of those wars like Korea. We didn't have access to the areas of combat after the war's conclusion. So really the things I've read, the things I've talked about, the veterans that were in it, in the recovery mission during the Vietnam War, didn't have a lot of information. People frequently ask me, why didn't we go in and get the POWs back? But I looked at some records after 1992 when they had the Senate Select Committee where they declassified a lot of stuff. There were 46 or 47 rescue missions launched in Vietnam during that time, and not a single American was recovered. That's when we had 500,000 Americans there. So it's difficult terrain, as Steve said. It was a difficult political situation, and we didn't have access to them. If you were wounded or left behind in Vietnam, you probably perished.
Steve, what was a typical rescue like for you?
Well, once we would get the call, you know, we flew to the place. The rescue team, it was comprised, you know, we normally had 4 A1 Sky Raiders, and they were in charge. You know, the flight leader of that was in charge of the rescue. He called the shots. You had a couple of Cobras, and we flew Jolly Greens. The A1s would go into the site, you know, they would soften it up. The Cobras, you know, would go in, they would hit it a little bit. Team leader or the flight leader of the A1s would let us know when to go in. The Cobras would fly cover for us, and the A1s still be high cover. And normally, you know, a lot of times, not normally, you know, but we'd go in, there wouldn't be any shooting until we would go in a hover. And once you get in a hover, all kind of stuff would break loose. You know, one of us, all the PJs had to go down on the hoist. You didn't know, you know, if the pilot was hurt, whether he could get on the penetrator, knew how to get on, or could remember how. He knows how, but does he remember?
Did you get all the people you went after?
No.
So there was some that you just absolutely no way to get to them.
I was part early on of one of the big rescues in Vietnam. You know, we flew out in the initial day, couple of days of it was an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. His call sign was Bat 21. They made a movie out of it. And we flew out on it, and you couldn't get to him. But he was eventually rescued by a Navy SEAL.
What do you know about the Sante prison attempted rescue?
I read a very good book on it. It's called The Raid by Benjamin Shimmer. I think it was from what I've read, it was a very daring raid. They had excellent people on it. I actually met one of the guys that was on it. But the intelligence, like so much intelligence at that time, relied on other means. And we didn't have any human intelligence there. And the prisoners were moved apparently because of some flooding. But the fact that they staged out of Nakhon Phanom and flew clear across North Vietnam and landed right in the courtyard there and got everybody out with only 1 or 2 wounded was an amazing.
Was that the mission that Colonel Bo Gritz was on? Was he a part of that?
No.
No, Colonel Bull Simonson.
Simons?
Yeah.
Is one, and I was one that was on it.
At what point in time did America start remembering the POWMIAs?
I don't really think they ever forgot them. You know, I think the issue of it come to light more after, you know, the repatriation of the ones from North Vietnam.
So, but wasn't the concern for the POWMIAs strictly with the family and friends of the missing person as opposed to a nation?
Probably most of it was.
I understand that there's a ceremony that we have today. It's called a POWMIA Remembrance Day. Who started this? Do you have any idea?
I looked back and couldn't really find when it was, you know, initially started.
Well, it's my understanding that the president has to authorize this on a yearly basis.
On a yearly basis.
You have any idea why they don't make this a permanent law, that it's, you know, they make other holidays for a lot of lesser reasons, I would think.
I don't know. I know September, and I think it's the third week of September is designated as National POW/MIA Day. I thought it was a public law, but it's certainly one of the most important holidays, and it's probably one of the most well observed.
Well, if the president has to renew it every year, that just, it seems like there's something wrong with that idea. I'm sure our current president will sign it as a day of remembrance, but I still think they should probably do something to make it permanent, because this POW/MIA issue is not going to go away, obviously. As long as Vietnam veterans are Vietnam veterans, they're always going to be pushing for a full recovery. Do you think that's even a practical idea today, that there would be a full recovery of these men?
No, from the Vietnam War?
Mm-hmm.
No. Our experience, when I commanded the Forensic Identification Laboratory, some of the remains we were getting, and you have to remember this was 15, 16 years ago, were tiny. They were fragmented. The soil in Indochina is very acidic, and unless you got a tooth with a restoration, it was extremely hard to get one. By contrast, some of the remains we got in other crash sites, Tibet, were almost preserved. But that's a very harsh environment. It was then, during the war, and it is now. So I don't think it's realistic to expect that you'll have a full accounting, but I think we've made a very good effort.
How much remains do they have to have in Hawaii to identify a person, generally speaking?
Well, I'm not a physical anthropologist, but if you have a restoration, a dental restoration, then they have records for it, that's legally sufficient to identify a person. Some of the things they do are quite amazing, and I was in awe all the time I commanded that outfit, because they can get a bone or a femur and tell the sex, the size, the age, and they narrow it down that way. And that's one of the reasons why they continue to go back into those sites, because they've got enough identification that they had a 5'7" crewman off of a B-26, and we found an ID card there, but we didn't have anything to positively identify him. So that's why you'll see that sometimes they revisit these crash sites continually until they're convinced they can't get anyone out of there.
Steve, don't you think that with the advent of DNA testing that we're going to be able to resolve a lot more of these cases?
Yeah, the way DNA testing has advanced, you don't have to have a whole lot to, match or get a DNA if, you have something to compare it to now.
Well, these families, they just like to know. I've talked to several families of POWs, missing in action, and they've carried this burden for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And before they die, that's their biggest request. If I just knew what happened to my son or my daughter or whatever, then we could have some closure in our family. And it's a very heart-wrenching thing, because they haven't lost faith. They haven't given up, and I really admire them for their tenacity and their strength. Do you think there's going to be a greater accounting in the future? I mean, are there going to be more teams going in with better methods of identifying these remains? Do you think we're going to see a better method, is what I'm trying to say?
I think the mitochondrial DNA method is probably going to be as good as it gets in our lifetime. But if there is a blood sample from a maternal side, they can do a positive identification if the remains they have are sufficient, and if they can sequence DNA from them. So it was a great help to us. This started, I believe, about 1990. It resolved some controversial cases. I was quite glad to see it, and I was quite glad to see how the Department of Defense started a dedicated laboratory to just that.
Steve, I understand that later part of our program today, you're going to be actually performing a POW/MIA Remembrance Day for us. Is there any other times during the year that you would do this?
We always do it on POW/MIA Day, and periodically at different VFW functions through the year, we will do this. It's not, we remember the POW/MIAs, daily, just not once a year. But
Well, when you come into the post, you have a very visual evidence that we can look at to remind us on a daily basis.
Yeah, we have a POWMIA table set up all the time.
When did the POW flag come to being? Do you have any idea?
There was a wife, and I forget her name, of a MIA in Vietnam in 1971, I believe, wanted to do something, and she was in Florida, and she got in touch with an individual in Florida, and he designed that flag. So it's 71 or 72.
I've seen that flag flying a lot more in a lot different places, and I do appreciate the government doing that. I know the post offices now and federal buildings, they're flying the flag, and at least it shows our government is aware of the situation too, and every time you see it, no matter where it's flying, you remember, and hopefully all people will. How do you tell a Vietnamese from an American if you're digging at an excavation site? How do you tell the difference between their guys and our guys?
It's very easy to determine anthropologically. It's U.S. or Caucasoid, and they're what they call Mongoloid remains, so it's a different composition in the bone, a different size and all that. The problem is that there were a lot of Americans lost over there, not a lot, but some, that were of Asian descent. Mm-hmm. And that's created problems in the past too. But we've gotten through it. I can't recall a single identification that was rejected because of that fact.
Mm-hmm. So, Steve, when you hold these ceremonies at the post, is that for all your members that take part in this, or?
Yes, each thing on the table represents a certain thing, and we'll normally have different members read one of them. It's a chapter participation thing.
I've seen some of these displays, and I've noticed there's been salt on a plate, like just a pinch of salt. What does that represent?
It represents the tears that have been shed for these individuals.
And I believe there was a candle there also. What part does a candle play in this ceremony?
Hadn't got my sheet of paper.
That's the light. The light will always be on
for them.
That's good. In Washington, haven't they started doing something different on when remains are recovered? Haven't they changed something about the names on the wall? When they
Yes, they do.
They have added names to the wall.
But don't they change? There's some kind of designation by the name.
Right. Once an individual is identified, there's a distinctive mark placed behind his name, and it's I believe a missing individual is denoted by a certain symbol, and when he's identified, a line's drawn through it or something like that.
So that way the average person would be able to tell that his remains have been recovered and he's now deceased.
What that means is his nation never gave up looking for him and brought him home and identified him.
I just know one thing from being in rescue. Mm-hmm. There is no other country in the world that their military will devote the effort, manpower, and equipment to get back one individual. That can be a private. Mm-hmm. They will put as much effort getting a private back as they will a full colonel, and I know that for a fact.
Has it been easier in Iraq to find someone after they were shot down, or if they went missing or something? Isn't the terrain and everything much easier for them to locate those flyers?
I don't have much current knowledge on it, but again, I mentioned the FA-18 that was lost on the opening night of Desert Storm. Mm-hmm. He was shot down about halfway between Amman, Jordan, and Baghdad, and he was lost for several years. And it was featureless flat desert, is what this team reported.
You can look for days over there and not see nothing. It's flat.
Yeah. Well, you've had you've been to Desert Storm and Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Any comment about the comparison?
When you're getting shot at, you're getting shot at. I think I was more leery in the Gulf because it was out of the element I was used to. It was different, and there wasn't any place to hide. Yeah. You couldn't couldn't hide in the bush. There wasn't no bushes.
So they pretty well had you where they wanted you, in other words.
That's it, out in the middle of nowhere.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you all for joining us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add about POW/MIA Remembrance Day?
I'd just like to invite everyone. It'll be on September 18th this year, Mike Miller Park in Graffinville, that we will be holding a POW/MIA remembrance there.
And my experience is, as long as there's Americans in combat and as long as they're lost in combat, the U.S. government will continue to do what we've always done. Go after them.
Thank you, gentlemen,
Amen.
for your time today. We appreciate you coming in and exploring this subject with us.
My pleasure.
POW/MIA Remembrance. With symbol and ritual, we remember the loved ones who have been left behind. With Missing Man Table, an honors ceremony, and the POW/MIA Remembrance Ceremony, we can reach out to honor our nation's unaccounted for prisoners of war and missing in action. The single rose in the vase is there as a reminder of the lives of each of the missing and the loved ones who kept the faith, still waiting for answers. The red ribbon tied around the vase shows our continued determination to account for the missing. A lemon slice at the bread plate is to remind us of the bitter fate of those captured and missing in a foreign land. A pinch of salt recalls the tears endured by those missing and their families who seek answers. The Bible represents the strength gained through faith to sustain those lost from our country, which was founded as one nation under God. An inverted glass symbolizes their inability to share in the day's toast. The chair stands empty to express their absence. A solitary candle burns to represent the upward reach of their unconquerable spirit. As Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said at the 2002 POW/MIA recognition ceremony, we remember and we rededicate ourselves to an accounting as fully as is humanly possible, for America can never move forward as long as even one missing son or daughter is left behind. The members of the Calvert City VFW Post 5739 and its Ladies Auxiliary reiterate the words of Secretary Rumsfeld.